welcome this afternoon to the first colloquium presentation of academic year 2015-2016. And we have with us, for our first presentation, Michael O'Connor. I don't know whether he knows this or not, but there was another Michael O'Connor, spelled slightly differently, who worked in the basement of Inlow for a number of years. And every time I think of him, think of one of them, I think of the other. Does that make sense? Anyway, I have to tell you a little bit about Michael, and then I'll tell you about his presentation. Michael has been here for 2 years, at least here at the College of Education at Eastern. He has an academic background in special education with a Ph.D. from University of Kansas, and he got that in 2006. It seems like such short time ago, doesn't it? 9 years goes quickly. He spent, looks like 8 years at Augusta State University in Georgia, and then he saw the better side of life and decided he would come west to indulge himself in his favorite activities of biking and kayaking. Yes. While he was at Augusta State, he was tenured and he was promoted. So when he came here, he came as an associate professor, and that's where he is now. He has published, I'm assuming that Teaching Exceptional Children is a journal. All right, so he's published in peer-reviewed journals. He likes to get out once a year to conferences, and he has one coming up in California here in a few weeks. And it's always kind of nice to see him in the hallway because he has a smile, and he's engaging, and working with children with special needs is a passionate thing, I believe, and it involves a lot of compassion. So, Michael, I think you're live with your mic, and I'm going to turn it over to you to help us out here.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone coming today. So today I want to talk about service learning. And by the way, I was very glad and very happy that the person named Michael O'Connor had such a good reputation here and that everyone liked him. Because when I'm talking to someone on the phone, they say, "Oh, Michael O'Connor, okay," and I'll say, "Not that one, the new one," but I hear he's still around. He does film, apparently, I think. So right, so he still lives in the area and so forth. So I've heard some good things about him. But today I want to talk about service learning. So in addition to special education, service learning is a big passion of mine. It's something that I've done a lot when I was a teacher in K-12, and so it's one of my major research interests. So some of my articles are working with students with disabilities with service learning, but this is something that's in general education as well. It's for everyone, and it's for K-12 as well as for higher education as well. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about today, is how this is something that it's a great way of teaching. It's a great way for students to learn, and it's not specific to special education, it's not specific to general education, to K-12 or to higher education. It works across the spectrum. As a matter of fact, service learning was first mentioned in the literature in regard to higher education. So the first people to start talking about, actually use the term service learning in the literature, came from colleges. And a lot of their idea about service learning was that it was a way to get students civically engaged. But let me introduce the subject by first talking about, what is service learning? And so what I want to do is I'm going to connect the idea of service learning to Common Core standards, which we're very aware of course, in education these days. Let's see, this doesn't seem to be. Okay, so what is service learning? Well, it's basically connecting community action with learning. So, it's both sides. Community service is something that we're very familiar with. For example, canned food drives and so forth. When you have people that do things for the community, but there's not a lot of learning tied in with that. So, service learning is really tying the idea of doing something for the community, being engaged with the community, with something that you're learning. So typically we tie research in with it. So it's not just doing something to be doing good works, but it's to engage students. And it's the idea that people learn best when it's connected to real life. So rather than just abstract learning, we connect learning to real life. I've got John Dewey down there at the bottom. He's kind of thought of as a person who really promoted this idea. Now, John Dewey was a philosopher, and so he wrote about education, but he wrote about a lot of subjects. And so his idea was that, there's a famous quote by John Dewey that education is not a preparation for life, it is life. And so that's a very famous quote by him. He said that education is something that is intrinsically involved. People should be intrinsically involved with the world around them, and that you learn best by things that are experiential. You learn best by experience rather than just abstract learning, and something that a lot of us sort of understand. Hands-on learning, experiential learning. You hear all these terms. This is the idea. And so people that talk about service learning almost always mention John Dewey. To his credit, he put some of these ideas into action, and he created a laboratory school in Chicago and actually put some of these ideas into action. And so any service learning literature that you come across will inevitably have John Dewey mentioned. It's interesting because I just came across, he's considered part of the pragmatist school of philosophy. And so there's, I don't know a lot about philosophy. That's a very deep subject. But there was an interesting quote that the pragmatists, one facet of pragmatism is that thought is not seen as just something that resembles or mirrors reality, but rather thought is a tool for inquiry. So think about that. Just kind of hold that in your mind. Thought as a tool for inquiry, because that's kind of the key theme today, is this idea of inquiry, learning through questioning, posing questions about the real world, and then, applying learning to that, trying to learn from that. So I think the best way usually to introduce service learning is to kind of give an example. So there's a famous example from Huntsville, Alabama. So there were some 8th graders, middle school students in Huntsville, Alabama, and they were on a field trip. And most of them were African American. And they were on a field trip to visit graveyards. And so they came to, it was an antebellum graveyard. So this was before the Civil War. And it was all Caucasian people buried there. And so they had, what do you think the natural question that they asked was? Where are the African American people buried in Huntsville, right? And guess what the caretaker told him? He said, I don't know. That was the answer. So there's the question. This is where we start. So I told you, remember that word inquiry. This is the question. So the question that they had in their mind was, where are our ancestors buried? These are kids that are interested in learning more about their own culture. Now that's natural, isn't it? We all care about our own culture. We all care about where we come from. And it's a fair question, isn't it? And so this became the beginning of a service learning project. It all started from the seed of this one question. And so they found out exactly where their African American ancestors were buried. And then they took a field trip to that cemetery and found that it was in really bad repair, that it really was in bad shape. So the teacher had some knowledge of service learning. She said, well, let's make this a learning project for the whole class. And so they mapped out the cemetery, which involved measurement, which involved mathematics. And they did some physical restoration of of the gravestones themselves. 166 gravestones they actually restored. And so that wasn't all of it. The next thing that they did is they went to the civic records. And so they went to City Hall and they started investigating the names of the people that were buried there. So they started learning more about civic records and how people, more about their ancestors and so forth. And everything that they learned through that process, they started writing down, and they ended up creating some curricular materials, basically little books and pamphlets that the 4th graders now use in Huntsville to study Huntsville history. So you see, starting from that one basic question, which was very much reality-based, they basically uncovered some local history, didn't they? And so, this was history that would have been lost otherwise. And what did they learn in the process? Well, they used some math. They learned about physical restoration and the things that it takes to repair, these physical gravestones made out of stone and so forth. And then they learned a lot about the city hall and records, genealogy and their own ancestry. And so that's kind of a classic example of service learning. Another one was the Chicago Water Quality Project, and these were some students in Chicago High School that had a very simple question: how come the water in our water faucet is brown and it tastes terrible? It's fair enough, right? Fair question, right? And that's a question you can see how everyone would have a personal interest in, right? Why does our water taste terrible? And so the teacher said, that's a great question. Let's find out. And so I'll leave it to you guys. What do you think? What did they have to do to find that out? Where did they start?
Where the water came from?
Yeah, you have to learn about the water purification system, don't you? Well, first of all, where it comes from, right? Which I'm imagining one of the Great Lakes in Chicago, right?
I hope.
But it has to be purified. And so you learn a lot about technology, science, water quality. Typically water is rusty looking because of what? Iron, that's right. So that's chemistry right there. See, so all these things were things that the kids did not necessarily know before. And, there's just really no end to how much you can learn about. I mean, personally, I don't know. Does everyone here know exactly how the water is purified here? No?
They add chlorine to it, I think, and a little bit of fluoride. But for the most part, we don't have to purify it because it comes from wells.
From deep wells, yeah. Well, that's good. Then you do know.
I kind of have to.
Oh, that's right. The mayor. I forgot we have the mayor here today. That's right. So, the interesting thing that I always talk about when I share this with students is, okay, so after we've learned about the water quality and about iron oxide and why, the physical reasons why the water tastes bad, what do you think, what does that question lead to? What would be the next question that, that's not necessarily scientific, but something else? Yeah, how do we change that, and why do we have to drink it? Why can't we change this? In other words, that's a political question, isn't it? I mean, that would eventually become advocacy, something that you'd be, talking to the people in the city about, or in the school system, and what can we do to improve this, right? So this is civic engagement. This would become a civic engagement. So, there's really no end to this, and if you just look at the natural questions that pop up, this is how service learning works. The service learning projects really need to begin with the students coming up with the original idea. That's kind of essential. I mean, it's so typical for teachers to walk in a classroom and say, okay, this is the question we're going to investigate, and this is the way, we work so often. But this turns it around a little bit, and this asks the students to come up with the questions, and it gets that buy-in, it gets that engagement. Okay, so is that a basic idea? I'll give you a general idea of a couple of service learning projects and how they work. Again, I've used this word inquiry again, based on a question, and certainly relevant to their lives and based on real experience. And so these are all things that John Dewey would promote as authentic education. Things that are really inquiry-based, experience-based, and relevant to their lives. So you can look at service learning projects, and they're kind of grouped into different types. Environmental projects typically involve water quality, and it's not hard to get people to, like the wildlife and fisheries people, to cooperate, to have your kids come out. They'll help you test water quality in streams and so forth, and they're usually very generous with their time. And there's nothing like, it's a lot better than learning just from books, right? And so that's the idea of service learning. Cultural history and awareness projects, that would be like the Huntsville project. That would be a good example of that. The kids were engaged in because it was their families. I remember I was assigned to write a paper about my own, background and my ancestors. And I remember that there was really something that was engaging for me because we all have an inherent interest in where we come from, right? Community enhancement, service projects. There's just no end. If you ask kids, what can we do to improve our community? What kind of ideas can they come up with? Almost inevitably, they'll have to do some kind of academic homework, some kind of academic legwork to figure out how to do these things. And advocacy, civic engagement projects, advocacy would be a good example, I think, where that water quality project would lead. In other words, now we know why this water is essentially polluted, but is it like this in all schools, and why is it like this in this school? I mean, this was an inner city school, and so it wasn't necessarily as well funded as some suburban schools, and so there might have something to do with that. So advocacy and civic engagement, there's a lot of examples of kids, high school kids, testifying before local school boards, before the mayor and the city council perhaps, and even Congress and so forth, and doing this kind of advocacy. So what I want to do next is I want to connect this up. Oh, okay, so let's talk about the research outcomes. Basically, the strongest ones are in social-emotional areas. So these are getting along with other people, having a sense of self-efficacy, that they can change things for the better. The idea and these are ideas that really, if you read educational research, people are really latching more and more onto social-emotional goals. Civic engagement, of course, the idea of being involved in the community, and then academic gains. And, there's often a criticism of service learning that, okay, well, the academic gains aren't necessarily there. It doesn't translate to test scores as well, And so this is a criticism of service learning, but in fact, I think you really have to look at the connection. If you look at the connection between civic engagement and also these social emotional goals, you'll see that they really do promote academic goals. And so there's some recent research that civic engagement, being involved in your community, has consistent and statistically significant gains, increases in academic engagement and achievement. Civic engagement increases graduation rates. I mean, when in K-12, we talk about at-risk kids as those kids that don't graduate. That's the kids that are at risk for not graduating. And so, if you talk about promote civic engagement, that does raise graduation rates. That is an academic gain. So again, the criticism of service learning, sometimes it doesn't translate directly to test scores, but I think you've got to look at the connections there. And here's some other ones. So increased academic learning, this idea of being an idea creator instead of just a passive receptacle of knowledge. Number 2, learn higher order critical thinking skills, communication, writing, interpersonal skills, real-life applications of math. Think about those examples that I gave you. These kids have to do all of these things. They're making decisions about the project. They're making decisions about what to do, the questions to ask, and how to go about these things. And they have to communicate all these things. And they have to negotiate among themselves as well. So it's many times in K-12, these are usually group projects. Number 3, relate the learning to their own lives. See the connection between knowledge and changing things for the better. And then finally, this develops the belief that they can and should make a difference in their communities. All of these things actually do promote academic success. Okay, so let's talk about Common Core now. And let's, just keeping those things in mind, see how this connects. Because, this is about, I'm suggesting service learning is a way to really address some of the things that are new in Common Core. And so, a lot of you are already familiar with this, but just to briefly kind of review where this came from, the Common Core standards are really, the latest set of standards that have come about in K-12 education. And it really all started in the 1980s, in fact, the accountability movement. People started talking about we need to create standards for K-12 education. And in fact, there was an author, E.D. Hirsch, in the 1980s, early 1980s, who promoted the idea that we should have national standards. And he put this in some of his writing. There was, some of the early accountability movement writing, and there was a strong backlash against And people said, no, we can't have national standards. That's crazy. That, that takes away the individuality of the states and so forth. There was a very strong backlash against this particular idea, and he backed off of it, which is interesting. So that was in the 1980s. He suggested that, the whole nation have a sort of common set of standards. He made the point that it's possible to be a child who moves from one state to another, and, you can be behind. You can be a year ahead of the other kids in your class, or a year behind just because you move from another state. So he said that's a problem in our educational system. But people said, no, we can't have a nationalized curriculum or anything like that. And so look how long ago that was. He really backed off that idea. Well, in 1994, these suggestions that we create some kind of standards continued. And in 1994, there was a law passed called Goals 2000. And that didn't require states to do anything, but it gave states money to create standards, state standards for learning. And so by the year 2000 or so, in fact, all the states had created state standards. And then in the year 2002, it was crafted in 2001, but it was finally signed in early 2002. No Child Left Behind, the famous K-12 law, was passed, and so it incorporated all those state standards that had been created. So the legal beginning of it was in 1994 with Goals 2000 law, and it was sort of realized in No Child Left Behind. Well, I think most people in the room are pretty familiar with No Child Left Behind and what that means. It's basically subjects schools to take tests that are pegged to these state standards, and it uses these scores to compare schools. And so we're all quite aware of this. And there's been a lot of criticisms of No Child Left Behind, but I think the strongest one, and one of the ones that you hear the most, is that it's based on multiple choice tests for the most part. And so that means that it's just sort of what we call lower level learning. Tell me the answer to this. It's a multiple choice. There is one answer. There's one right answer, and it's very reductionist, and it's kind of, in learning theory, we call it lower level learning. There's not a lot of critical thinking involved. It's just memorization, really. And so that's this criticism that teaching to the test and so forth is something, that's bad, has a lot of validity when you talk about using only multiple choice tests, and you're just asking kids to just more or less learn facts without necessarily applying them to anything in life, without necessarily looking at them critically or examining them, and just memorizing them. So I think it's a valid criticism. So these federal laws like No Child Left Behind have to be reauthorized, generally every 7 years or so. No Child Left Behind was a reauthorization of a law that was first passed, the Elementary and Secondary Education Law. Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed in 1965, and it's been reauthorized, at regular intervals ever since then. Well, this one hasn't been reauthorized yet, 2002. The first attempts were made in 2007. People started talking about reauthorizing it, and here we are, it's 2015. This is unprecedented in the history of this law. The deadlock is incredible, and we're not even going to pass it this year now. They're still fighting over this law, and it's just one of these laws that has just been intractable. Nobody knows how to reauthorize this. It's so controversial, and again, this criticism is really a sticking point. But I leave it up to you to look at why they haven't been able to reauthorize this law. This is completely unprecedented. And so, what has been suggested now is, and has been really this has been, since about 2009, people started talking about something called Common Core state standards, developing a new set of standards that people could accept, that the states could accept, not a federal curriculum, not something that's being dictated by the federal government, but chosen by the states, but that's a new kind of set of standards. And so that's what I want to talk about. What's the difference between Common Core and the standards that we had before? Does anybody know? I mean, what's the primary difference between these two animals? What's that?
Literacy and 21st century skills across all content areas.
Okay, so what are 21st century skills then? Right. Yeah, I was reading a book last night. I was talking about way back in the 20th century. Someone was talking about that, right? So things have changed, right? Things have changed. Yeah, absolutely. I think those are absolutely. And then, but there's another part. I think is the Common Core, and this is what. The more I've been reading about Common Core, this is what what sort of inspired this talk is that it's more about critical thinking and inquiry as well, and that perhaps it's less about. Yeah, John.
You can make that point, but the math standards are the ones I know well. And the math standards always have process standards, and they always have standards around critical thinking and problem solving and those things. What really made the difference for the previous standards and the standards now is how they're assessed. And if you assess them just with a multiple choice where you need to find the answer, it doesn't make any difference what you say about the standards. You're only assessing certain things. The smarter balance tests are assessing it differently in math. That's probably has a better chance of changing math instruction.
That's great. That's great. And that's a great point, the assessment. In other words, are we just going to keep the multiple choice format, or are we going to assess things differently? And I think that's very much true. And that's another difference that's coming out, is that when we talk about using inquiry and using more critical thinking, that requires writing. That requires extended responses, and it requires more than just identification of multiple choice. And so that's the connection there. So, one of the criticisms that's come out about Common Core is that there's going to be more difficult. And why is that? And these are the things, these are the differences that we're seeing now. In other words, so the history of it is that over 40 states have signed on to the Common Core state standards. They plan to use them, or already are using them. And there's been a lot of political controversy about it, but I think that's a lot of that is kind of beside the point. If we just look at the pedagogical reasons, these are some of the ways that these are different than the No Child Left Behind standards. And so these are some of the things that are being, that in my reading of it and everything that I'm coming across, that I'm finding more of these things. So in-depth analysis of topics, inquiry-based learning, close reading in language arts. Close reading means asking the whys, and not just asking the facts of something, but asking why, asking students to analyze these things. There's a switch in language arts where they are very much emphasizing nonfiction versus fiction, and having kids look for answers in texts and so forth. And so it goes a little bit beyond just a multiple choice thing. Literacy and history, social studies, science, and technology. And so this is the basic idea, critical thinking and higher level inquiry. And this is where I see the connection to use in service learning here. Let me give you some quotes that I just took, some recent quotes from people talking about the Common Core, what's different. So this was it's an interesting article that came out just a few weeks ago in Education Week. And it talked about the fact that teachers are trying to figure out ways to learn how to ask, better questions of students and get students to ask the questions themselves. So what they're saying is that the Common Core is going beyond simply asking them to cite an example or find an answer in the text. It means encouraging them to build interpretations and analysis from what they've read. And a number of new programs are being developed to help teachers learn to ask better questions. So this was I found interesting, is that this is a new sort of movement in education that we're trying to figure out how to get students and teachers to ask more in-depth questions, to create more inquiry and in-depth, higher-order thinking in the classroom. And it just struck me that service learning is kind of a natural there. It's just a natural fit, because that's exactly what we do in service learning. So, to me, when they were saying, how can we do this? This is a problem. These people have gotten large amounts of grant money to write a new program to teach us how to put more inquiry and more, critical thinking into schools, rather than just, saying, find the answer. rather than just lower level thinking. And to me, you know, it was just an obvious fit. Service learning is exactly what has been doing that all along. That's what it's all about. Critical thinking, inquiry-based, starting with a question. So these are quotes from that article. Most teachers ask students to identify surface features of the text. This is just a study that, you know, some research that's been done. And these did not translate to deeper understanding or the ability to apply what they had learned. So again, application in real life. Again, just a clear fit with service learning. Close reading is intended to push students to think more deeply and critically about what they read. And then this was a great quote that really, I thought, again, you know, matched up with service learning very closely. There are real problems in society that we want kids to be reading about. Water quality, investing in space exploration, so forth. Water quality, so there you go. So this is, you know, it's not an absolutely new idea. This is something we've been doing for a long time, and it's something that's just kind of been sitting there as far as I'm concerned. Like service learning has always done this. And then the best quote that I saw in relation to what I've been telling you about service learning, as they ask more open-ended questions, and again, that's what all this, there's this new grant money out there promoted, you know, being given to help teachers learn how to ask more open-ended questions, you know, to get students to think more critically. And these, you know, these techniques are already out there. Service learning is one of them. As they begin to ask more open-ended questions, they also begin to step back and encourage students to ask the questions themselves. Service learning, again, classic service learning practice. It starts with the students coming up with the questions. This is a quote from Ariel Sachs, is a language teacher who wrote a sort of an op-ed piece in Education Week. She's also written a book. She's also published a book. And so this is what she said about her experience with the Common Core standards. Again, emphasis on developing students' critical thinking skills. I saw a push to have students do more of the thinking in the classroom, interpreting text for themselves, and using evidence to support their arguments. And then in addition, some emphasis on their expression, speaking and discussion skills and so forth. So I'm just, you know, I just put the exact quotes up here because I didn't want it to just be me talking, just give a variety of voices. You know, there's an English teacher. As a matter of fact, her criticism of her main criticism of Common Core standards were that not enough teachers were involved in their creation, actually, in designing the standards, and that was something she put in here. But again, these themes kept coming up over and over again, that it's about critical thinking, real life applications of knowledge, having students ask questions, you know, having students express themselves, and as John said, the assessment has to take that into, you know, they have to, whether in classroom assessment or the test themselves, having the students express themselves. And so I think, you know, I think there's a lot of positive, that's a positive direction, it seems to me. Oh, and so the other part is, you know, connecting this up. Why should we be using service learning in higher education? I think since we are on board with the Common Core standards and we are going forward with this, you know, and we're teaching teachers in the education department, you know, I think we should be exposing them to these kinds of methods of teaching so that they can pass those on to their students as well. So I think it's kind of a natural fit with the education department that we use service learning. And I know there's some of my colleagues use it, and I use it in my class. I have students do various service learning projects. One that we're doing now is resource maps. So students are finding out information about resources that are available to people in a community, and they're compiling those resources and then getting those out to the people in the community that need them. So things like food and shelter and medicine and so forth, things that people need, services that are available out there, which, by the way, there's always some of the things are really surprising, like there are nonprofit agencies that will get kids glasses and so forth, and people don't really realize this until they go out and look for this. Well, I have my students collecting information on these kind of nonprofits in their community and then publishing them, essentially. So it's not just an academic exercise in finding out what's out there, but it's getting them to the people that need them. And so, that's just one little service project that I'm doing this term. And I always try to do one at least each term, something like that. So again, it's a natural fit for the education department. I think if we want to see more K-12 service learning, then we should be modeling that ourselves. Another criticism, and it was certainly a criticism of mine, of No Child Left Behind, was that it kind of killed service learning because it became all about multiple choice tests and practicing for this test. And it became very difficult to get K-12 schools to want to let kids to go out in the field and do these kind of exploratory or kind of open-ended educational activities when they just wanted to prep for the test because they had to pass these multiple choice tests. So I'm hopeful that embracing the Common Core standards with their focus on inquiry and critical thinking, student-led questions, relevance to real life, I'm hoping it'll promote rather than kill service learning, because truthfully, that's what No Child Left Behind did to a lot of service learning in K-12. So far, service learning has had its best decade. It was in the 1990s. And that's when we saw the most service learning in practice in K-12 schools, the most literature coming out about it, really some of the most exciting projects. Then No Child Left Behind was passed in 2002, and the focus became all about standardized tests, making AYP, schools were under the gun to have kids do very well on these multiple choice tests that many of them were what we call lower level, and the kind of thing where schools felt like they had to drill students rather than let them ask their own questions. We had to have them prepared for the test for the benefit of the school. And so it was rough. It's been rough for service learning for the last 13 years now since No Child Left Behind was passed. And so I'm hopeful that Common Core with this emphasis on inquiry will be better for us. But the other aspect, so again, it's a kind of it's almost a no-brainer that, in education, School of Education, we probably should be doing this. But what about in other areas of higher education? What about people in arts and science? What about people who teach in business and so forth? And, the people in the colleges in higher education are saying, there's another possible outcome or another possible result of having Common Core being used so widely across the country, which it is. Like I said, over 40 states have adopted this, and this is the way that we are going. And so what they're saying is that it's going to change the nature of the students that are coming to college. It's going to change the way that these students think and learn and engage in school. And so, basically they're saying we are going to have a different kind of student coming. And so here's one example of that. So I think it does have relevance for all of higher ed, not just colleges of education. And so here's some quotes, a quote from two representatives of higher ed. And characteristics of Common Core students entering college are learning experiences featuring more inquiry-based learning and collaborative problem solving, more hands-on work. They will have also experienced applying mathematical concepts to real-world problems. So you see these concepts come up again and again. Applications to real world, inquiry, collaborative problem solving. I think it's a better way of learning. So I'm not standing up here just to be a cheerleader for Common Core standards, but this is the way that we're going. And so I look for the things that are positive in it. I do hear the political arguments out there. And, I'm just choosing to focus on the positive. I'm looking for the good stuff. And, as a service learning proponent, I see a lot of hope in this. I really see this as a good direction. And maybe we'll get No Child Left Behind reauthorized after 13 years. It'll have a new title, of course, but that's supposed to happen next year now. Of course, they've been saying that for a while, but By the way, in concert with this, the next generation science standards, the Common Core is in language arts and in math. And there's a focus on literacy and history, social studies, mathematics, and science. But there are also the next generation science standards. Here's a quote that is very similar. And so you can see the recurring themes here. Students are giving a big question that they can relate to a mystery of sorts. Through their investigation of that question, they hit on other phenomena along the way that they also need to investigate and explain. So that's where it starts. Whether the student comes up with the question or the teacher, it's a large question. And so what's an example of that? Students were told there was a large decrease in the number of Galapagos finches between 1976 and 77. Why? They were given access to some data, and that's all they were told. So they found that there was a drought, and the seeds that the birds eat were depleted. So the birds with longer beaks survived because they could open leftover tough-shelled seeds. So they found this out, and all they were given was this information. You say that there was a large decrease in the population of these birds. So it's investigative in nature, and basically a lot of the Common Core, if you look in depth at these interviews with the language arts teacher and some of the other people using Common Core, it's kind of like that. A lot of this is a recurring theme. You give students a generalized question, and you're not asking them. In other words, there's not necessarily one right answer. It's investigative, and they can go in different directions to try to investigate this question, but they have to use academic knowledge to do it. And so from there, the students probe a similar phenomenon, why peppered moths were more prominent during the Industrial Revolution. Does anybody know the answer to that, basically? Right. Protective coloration, having soot all over the place. So if your wings look like they had soot on them, you could hide more easily. That's right. It wouldn't stand out to predators as much. So exactly. So you guys would do very well in Common Core. Good, because you'll be teaching it. So I have some information about how to do service learning, and I kind of offer myself as a reference for that. If you'd like to talk to me about it, if you'd like to just bat around some ideas about how you could incorporate this in your classroom with your students, just some ideas. But these are the basic guidelines to kind of, if you want to start thinking about doing these things. I usually, many times I open it up to the students, and I say, come up with a service learning project. I kind of give them this outline. I kind of give them a primer in what service learning is. And then I just ask them to come up with their own projects, and they come up with great ones. And I've really had some amazing projects that my students have done, many times with their students, because I'm in teacher education, so they work with K-12 students. And, I've actually seen projects where students will come and volunteer on a Saturday, and they'll all turn out to do some kind of community project in their community on a Saturday. Now, that's proof that it's working, right? I mean, that shows above and beyond, right? And so, but it really is great if you let the students come up with the questions. You can be really surprised, and I think it's a better experience for them too if they come up with the questions themselves. So here's the idea. Ideally, you have the students organize the project. You have the students lead the project, organize it, come up with the question. There's a lot of learning in that, right? All the negotiation and so forth that has to happen that many times the teacher takes over, happens with the students if you just let them do it. Now, how many people have ever had that experience of having a student say, you say to a student, you're trying to get them to think deeply about a subject, and you kind of pose something like that. Why is that? Like the peppered moth example that I just gave. And you give that example to a student, and they say something like, I have a better idea. You're the teacher. Why don't you just tell me the answer? Have you ever had that experience, and you go, isn't that frustrating? you don't want them to say that. And I'm always trying to say, well, yes, I'm the teacher, but I want to be a different kind of teacher. I don't want to just give you the answer like that. I want you to think about it. It's the kind of teacher that gets you to think like that. And so that's what I see, at least the Common Core kind of aiming towards, this direction aiming towards. So let them lead it as much as possible. And then, I don't want to wrap up without talking, a little bit about what is good service learning practice. It's not just doing the project, it's the reflection that's really probably the most important part. And if you look at service learning literature, it's always very important that students have time in the classroom to reflect on what they did, to either write about it, to publish it, to talk about it, because it's in that reflection time that they really realize the depth of what they did. So it's really important that they have time to do that. Structured opportunity to reflect on what they've achieved in the project. The example of the kids in Huntsville, they actually produced materials. They actually produced written materials, and then someone else came along and wrote about it. So there was a lot of reflection about what that project achieved. And so, you might not have that level of sort of visibility of the project, but have the kids reflect on it at least. And so these are, and it doesn't have to be papers, films, artwork, presentations. These are just some of the ideas that again, these are just to encourage you if you're thinking about doing something specific service learning project or even just opening it up to your students. I'd be glad to provide some guidance on what the literature says, but the reflection is critically important. That's it. There are some sources here, and so we have a resource guide through the library there, and I can send you that link if you like. And Sally Milkey put that together. That was wonderful. Some of these Corporation for National Community Services right at the top of that list, as a matter of fact, of that resource guide, and that's kind of the primary organization for service learning, nationwide. So there's a lot of different branches of this. Campus Compact is specific to higher ed, the service learning specific to higher ed. So again, service learning really it started off in higher ed as a way to just get students civically engaged in their community with the idea of civic professionalism in mind, that universities and university people should give back to their communities, and so I think it's all universities and K-12 schools. We see community service. We do see that focus on community service across the country, but not necessarily tying the learning to it. It's not just the service that matters, but if you can tie learning to it, then you've got a built-in engagement, you've got built-in motivation for learning, and so there's a lot of good benefits there. So, questions?
So on one hand, we have the multiple choice questions that are theoretically lower level, right? And this is kind of a higher level, harder to pin down, maybe more amorphous, but maybe richer kind of learning.
Right.
So how would the more marginal students in a place like LeGrand fare there as opposed to something more structured that maybe even considered a lower level?
Right. Well, it's one of the reasons they were developed, the Common Core, was the idea was college and career readiness. And so there was an example that I read about an ACT test, and about a third of the students did not meet proficient levels at college and career readiness. But you know what? The students who were first generation students, college students, a lot of them, I mean, in other words, their parents did not go to college, so they would be the first generation to go to college. 50% of them did not even hit those levels. So the idea of this, and that was something that those higher education reps talked about a lot as well. That what we're hoping for from Common Core is that these standards will make students more ready for college and career. That it'll actually help them in other words. So, will they fare better? I think everybody. Right. Right, but I think ultimately they will do better, but they'll be challenged more at first. I think everybody agrees with that. One of the criticisms, one of the things that people are scared about with Common Core is that the tests this year are going to be, the first time when you introduce Common Core the first year or so, that the test scores are going to drop, that students are not going to be able to handle this as well as the multiple choice stuff that they've been used to before. And so, there is that, but they're hoping, again, that this is actually going to be better for them in the long run. These representatives of higher education, that's one of the things that they were saying, that hopefully the new students, after a few years of Common Core curriculum and having a curriculum that's more inquiry-based and richer, that they'll be able to do better.
So maybe as a father of a 10th grader, I should homeschool him for 11th and 12th grade.
I don't know. That's one of the big arguments about the Common Core, is that the parents are scared. This idea that your child tested proficient this year and next year may not test proficient.
And you're making an assumption that he tests proficient. Somebody that doesn't test proficient this year, all of a sudden, these things are coming down.
Yeah, but I think many times they did see scores drop when they went to Common Core. Go ahead.
So another answer to your question, Peter. There was a Stanford professor named Joe Buller looked at math scores, and there was two identical schools. She started in England, and she took two working class schools in England that were similar in all different ways. And in one school, they had to both schools had to take the standards test at the end of it. And one school focused on computation, the type of things that were on the test, and the other school focused on this type of service learning, project-based learning, and with the idea that the students will be more engaged, they'll learn to be problem solvers, and they might get a sense that the math and science they were using was useful. When they looked at their scores on the year-end test that measured computational ability in mathematics, the one at the school that did service learning did actually better than the students in the other one. So what Bowler concluded was that engaging students in the process of thinking and problem solving, and then they have to discover the type of computational skills they need, stays better than teaching them computational skills and procedures without any context.
I've got a question, and I'm not sure. It's kind of a statement and a question. This is really intriguing stuff to me, because I think it's because of its relevance not just to K through 12 but for higher ed. Mm-hmm. And we think about doing this, and I could see a lot of places in business courses, for instance, for this kind of approach. Here are the questions. The first question is, how do I do this? Because I'm not trained as I'm trained in a concept area and not as a teacher. Mm-hmm. And so if I find this intriguing and I think it's valuable to my students, I need to understand how to do it, and this could be a role for CTLA. The second question is, we better learn it. We better learn how to do this and ramp it up, because am I wrong in assuming that we're going to be getting students that are capable or have expected this?
Yeah, that's kind of the point. Yeah, exactly. They're going to be used to this, and they'll be able to handle it. But as you point out, there's a level of engagement and excitement about learning that comes with that, and I agree with you. We're going to have to.
Yeah. We have to become proficient as instructors in higher ed, and maybe and it behooves us to start now with students that never haven't had the experience, this learning experience, because in 5 years we could have those students, and that's going to create a whole different situation if they walk in the door and expect this kind of continued opportunity to learn. And we don't give it to them, and we're still asking them to answer multiple choice questions, and we're expecting them to learn by computation or by rote memory, we're going to fail miserably.
Yeah, exactly. That was the point that the higher ed people were saying, that it's a different kind of student that's going to be coming to us. And that is for sure, because like I said, Common Core has been adopted. It's been adopted in Oregon. This is going forward. Now, service learning is just one form of problem-based learning. You know, it just ties the real world in pretty well, and it ties community service. You can make up hypothetical problems as well. You know, inquiry-based learning has many forms. This is just the one that I know the best.
So before I dominate, I have one, I'm going to sort of throw this on the floor, because I hear this often from my colleagues in business, where we have quite literally 2/3 of our students are online. Is it possible to do service-based learning in an online environment? And if so, how do you structure?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's what I'm doing. I mean, I have an online class, and so I give them the assignment to go out and do something, or I give them, a basic outline, and I let them come up with the basic problem. But this term, what I'm doing is I'm having them, the class is about collaboration and about working with other agencies. So there's a lot of, academic, like I had them go out and learn about the other agencies, the nonprofits that are out there. But I'm having them do a service learning project, which means that they're going to compile all the information and contact information for all these nonprofits that can help people in their community, and then they're going to get it to the people in the community. So they're actually going to distribute these. I mean, I've had, now I've seen this done before, and, I've seen people actually publish little booklets of these nonprofits, people that provide food and shelter and stuff, and go out in areas where homeless people live and publish little, books that you can put in your back pocket, kind of durably published, and go out and distribute these to people that really need them. So this is the idea. So I'm doing it, and I think I really found that students, for one thing, they always thank me for it. They always say, this was, I really enjoyed doing this, and they got something out of it. So yeah.
First, I apologize for being late. And perhaps you covered all of this, but something that you said when I walked in the room had to do with Common Core state standards and first-generation students. And I'd like to maybe connect the dots with EOU's own history, that in 2008 we were a beta campus for AAC&U's high impact practices, and the underlying assumption for our incoming freshman classes was that starting with the knowns, that we knew the demographics were changing in the nation. We knew in particular in Eastern Oregon that those demographics were projected to change at an accelerating rate through 2030 towards the Hispanic population. And what they were really trying to test at Eastern was, because we had so many first-generation students and they were very excited about a potential Native American population that would be coming to our campus, is that the make excellence inclusive. And based on George Koo's high impact practices and interactive learning, and really hammering at these essential learning outcomes through hands-on, small community-based, rich experience, deep learning experiences that the students would be exposed to, that they had the data that any learning gaps that might be perceived in an SAT or ACT or standardized ETS testing situation was closed very quickly through high impact practice learning. And I'm wondering if the Common Core state standards that are now implementing across the states have some correlation to evening the playing field and really kind of getting at the college ready question a little bit differently so that we're not disadvantaging an entire population that I guess is not acculturated around the standards of testing. And I actually experienced it when I took, as part of a conference paper, I took the praxis to test if our curriculum was lining up with the questions that were being asked in the praxis exam, partly out of curiosity, but partly also because our success rate in the College of Education of our students, it's like, what are we doing wrong in English, that students aren't passing at a... Those tests had nothing, we were teaching a multicultural curriculum, and the tests had nothing to do with, they were asking about characters and tests of the Dubervilles,
Right.
So it was a complete mismatch.
Right.
And so no wonder, and there was at least one possible answer. I'm sure there were other variables, but it makes me curious about the Common Core state standards implementing, and now our admission standards are if you've got a 3 or a 4 on a test case basis, we're not going to adhere to AccuPlacer. That this is one of those, see if it works. And so I'm curious.
Yeah, I came across something that was similar to that said that the students from other cultures did make better gains under this. But if you think about it, if you're talking about a cultural pride program, a cultural pride project where students are talking about, they have to do research into their own culture, of course they're going to be more excited about school. They're going to be more engaged. And you're right about the testing too. We always talk about achievement gap, but what we specifically mean is the difference in the test scores, actually. And there may be an artifact of the testing and the way that we test rather than, truly a more general idea of knowledge. So I agree. Especially when you let the students pick the questions. Let them figure out, let them decide what they want to research, what they get excited about, and you are going to get better engagement. And, the research is clear that the more engaged students learn more. So, yeah, I think so. Multiculturalism. By the way, I was giving a talk about service learning to the LeGrand teachers, and they said the same thing that I said about No Child Left Behind, that they said that 10 years ago they had a big... a way of learning here that was very integrated, cross-curricular, and project-based, and they said that No Child Left Behind kind of killed that. So the teacher told me the same thing. Yeah.
I'd like to take more questions, but we're after the hour, and I want to wrap things up and move forward. I'm kind of glad Michael is across the hall because I'm going to knock on your door here in the not too distant future.
I want you to.
I'd also
anyone else is invited to do that, please.
And as a member of CTLA, I'll try to bring that forward and see if we can't get some workshops for faculty interested in doing service learning.
Be glad
so thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
And there's lots of goodies in the back.
Yes.